Good evening. Welcome to this new session of the references cycle that is devoted to the fights for the right to housing. We're having a tiny technical glitch, I believe. There we are. Okay, as I was saying, this is the third session devoted to the fights for the right to housing. We had a first session in which we discussed with Rachel Rolnick, urban planner from Brazil, and the housing councillor from the Barcelona City Council, Lucia Martin. We talked about the representation of the malaise, of the housing malaise and the ills of housing in contemporary debate, and to go beyond the private sphere and take it to the public. And we had Martha Rosler, the artist, and the curator, Carla Guerra, in the second session. And today we will try to discuss the organized struggles, unionism, to try and set up new forms of struggle, new forms of coexistence. And that's why today we bring this cycle to an end with Barbara Steenbergen and Carme Arcarazo. Unfortunately, Jaime Palomera hasn't been able to make it, but luckily, and we're very happy and grateful to Carme for having accepted the invitation to replace him, to have this chat on unionism in the housing sphere. She is the spokesperson of the Tenants Union here in Catalonia. Carme is an economist, a policy scientist by the Amsterdam University. She's the spokesperson of the Tenants Union. She specializes in the study of cities in Mexico, where she studied an urban management postgraduate degree, and she has a master's in urban studies from Barcelona, and she has worked in urban labs in Mexico and in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. And she focuses on research and the actual design of public policies. And we are very lucky today to have with us Barbara Steinbergen, who has a degree in public administration and a master's degree in political science by the Bonn University in Germany. Since 2007, she has been the head of the EU office of the IUT, the International Union of Tenants, and she's also specifically in charge of political relations with the EU. She presided over the European Forum of Housing between 2009 and 2012, and she's a member of the EU's Urban Agenda for Housing. So I believe that we have two fantastic and very experienced women to tell us about the history of union struggles for housing in Europe, where this has a long-standing tradition, as Barbara will tell us, and then compare it with the movement that we have here, the Sindicat de Llogateres, the Tenants Union, that has entered the social movement and the political sphere radically. It has made a radical entrance, and violent in a way, violent in the sense that it was unexpected, right? I was not referring to any actual violence, but it's been a radical emergence, and it has shaken the social movements and the struggles for the right to housing, which is one of the key elements that are promoting public policy making in our institutions today, and specifically in the Barcelona City Council. And that is happening regionally and nationally too. And hopefully we will have the chance to discuss the new rental control law or rent regulation. And let's see if we can be positive or not so positive about the new law. In any event, we are delighted to have with us today both Barbara and Carme to discuss and reflect together about this awful problem, as Rachel Rolnick mentioned to us, this housing precariousness in this world that is characterized by financialization and corporate power, and the ethics of profit, of financial profit, is the only criterion when it comes to building a reality. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Barbara to make a brief introduction and to tell us about the history of housing unions in Europe. A very different story than the one we have here, especially in Germany and Sweden, and for her to tell us about the current situation in Europe, which are the struggles that are in place, and then we will move on to a dialogue with Carme, and later we will open the floor to the audience. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you very much, Carme, and thank you all of you here for being here in this last session of the cycle devoted to housing struggles. And thank you to the technical team and the Born team. Barbara, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, to Barcelona. I'm joining you from Brussels, and it's a pity I cannot be with you, but we have currently already some restrictions because of the pandemic to travel. And for us, it is very, very important that we can keep our offices open in order to fight for tenants' rights. So I cannot risk quarantines or something like that might come with traveling. So anyway, I'm here to talk to you, and I hope this dialogue, although it is a virtual dialogue with me, will be very interesting for you. So thank you for the audience that you joined us. Well, talking a little bit about the history of the tenants unions, I have to go back very, very long in time. The first tenants union has been founded, has been established in 1899 in Germany. This is one of the oldest tenants unions we know. It has been founded in Dresden. And this is the way how the tenants movement actually started. So the tenants movement is a movement, you can compare it a little bit with the social movement of the trade unions. It started, of course, because something went wrong on the housing market. In that time, we had a massive industrialization everywhere in Europe, and the workers, they had to live in very unhealthy conditions. They had to live in overcrowded housing. They had actually no rights because the landlord could ask for everything. They could ask for a very high rent. They could also displace the tenants immediately, throw them out of their home. So the tenants actually had no rights. And it was necessary to organize ourselves in order to create a level playing field with the landlords. And so the first tenants union started. They mobilized, they demonstrated on the streets. There were manifestations, and they said it cannot go on like that because person needs a home. You cannot be part of the society without a roof over your head. Your children cannot go to school. You cannot work. And this roof over your head has to be decent and adequate and healthy and affordable. So this is actually how it all started. And we heard it already in the introduction. Housing is characterized by profit. Housing is characterized by being in the hands of private investors. Housing is characterized by not being accessible for everybody. The opposite is true. So what has started in 1899, it is still extremely actual and topical. It is still one of the most important questions that we have in society, to create access to affordable, healthy, and adequate housing for everybody, because we believe that housing is a fundamental right. So this is how the tenants movement started. It was necessary to protect our people and to organize ourselves in order to become stronger against the landlords, in order to have a say and in order to go on the political agendas. That was important. And that was also the start of the rent law. So it was necessary that we created a law to protect the tenants. It was necessary to have an equal footing with the landlords. And it was necessary to organize ourselves in order to become a political player. I think in the countries where we have this long-standing tradition of tenants unions, and these are the countries, I would say, of the global north and west, where we have these old tenants movements, and strong tenants movements, I think we are full political players. I think no government would do something without first asking us, but of course they will ask also the landlords. But it is on equal footing. And this is what we achieved. And this is important. So you cannot circumvent us. Anything that is decided about housing policy, about rent law, we have to be consulted. And this is institutionalized. And I think this is very important to know because the movement in Spain, the movement in Catalonia, it's not so old, of course, it's younger. And I think this is what you would like to achieve too, to become a partner for every government who is in charge and deciding about housing policy and rent law, who is deciding about financing housing, who is deciding about housing subsidies and allowances. And I think this is a very important thing to know. That for us, it is supernatural, let me put it like that we are asked. And this is something that we have in the countries where we do have, first of all, this long-standing tradition, the history of tenants unions, but also in countries where we have large rental markets. In the countries where the tenants unions are strong, the majority of the people is renting their house. I think this is also something which is not the case at the Spanish markets, where you have more home ownership, which might be based on historical decisions. For us, the majority who is renting in our countries, we say, well, why should we become homeowner? Because we cannot afford to pay this house. And then we are more or less the slave of the banks, where we have to pay the mortgages. So what we can afford is hopefully the rent. So we prefer to rent. It's, I think, another mentality. So, and where you have these big rental markets, of course, it is quite obvious that you can organize the people very well. I can tell you from my city of Berlin, there our union has 175,000 members. So in Germany, we have in total 3 million members. So this is comparable like a membership in the trade unions. We are as strong as they are. So, and this is also what we then negotiate. So we negotiate about rent freezes, about rent caps, about how the money of the state budget is directed into affordable housing and social housing. These are the jobs that we are doing. And yeah, so I can tell you this is, for us, it's very, very natural that we do it. I'm working for the Tenants Union now more than 20 years. And I can tell you it is one of the, I think, most interesting work you can do as an activist, as well as a lobbyist, an interest representative for tenants' rights. So perhaps this as a start. Later on, if you like to, I can also tell you a little bit more of what is currently going on at EU level when it comes to housing rights, when it comes to financing of housing, financing of renovations. but perhaps this as a start from the historical perspective of the tenants movement.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you. So, Karma, I'm looking at you now. Barbara was describing the tradition in Europe since the end of the 19th century. Can you tell us a bit about the situation here? Just for starters, yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much for having invited us. Hello, everyone here at Elborn. Of course, the contexts are radically different, Barbara's and ours. The tenants union here, I'll explain how we were born, etc. But we were born out of a desert, an organizational desert. Since 1931, we had no reference in terms of tenants unions, nothing at all. But it's not just that. In our country, we don't have that much public housing stock. And as Barbara was saying, well, the society here is based on the concept of ownership. It's not that much about the culture or preferences, but it's the gearing system, it's the engine forcing the people to actually end up buying rather than renting, because the regulation, the rental market regulation is not secure enough, it's not affordable, so it's restricted to those who could not possibly afford buying. So it's a question for probably another debate, because it's a political debate, this issue. And then, of course, let me start by saying that the boom, the bubble of rental prices, this has been a phenomenon in the international arena, but in Spain, actually, this takes a very special shape. Let me explain this. As of 2008, we know that large banks ended up having loads of apartments and flats of people that have been evicted. They didn't know what to do with so many households, so they did the following. This bubble, this mortgage bubble, has been translated onto the rental market, and now we have a rental market bubble. So the legal entity where the vulture funds are involved enters into play, and then the contracts are reduced in terms of periods down to 3 year period rental contracts. So that's the red carpet for the vulture funds. It's like calling on them, come to Spain, and you can invest in this rental market and you will be rich in a minute. So that led to abusive price increases from 2012 to 2019. The rent prices doubled, literally, and that, of course, was translated into lots of evictions. The families received a notification telling them either you accept this price increase, 300 euro, 400 euro increase overnight, or you can leave, or you're free to leave. So visible evictions, as we've seen on the news, the police forces taking people out of their homes, and invisible evictions as well. When the contract expires for many families, many households cannot afford those price increases, so they silently decide to leave, or some other people just are not offered a potential contract renovation because the landlord knows for sure that the family is not going to be able to afford this. So that happens in Spain, and you know that here a large proportion of the income in the household is devoted to the rent. Half of the earnings are devoted to paying the rent here in Spain. So we realized that, well, it's an abusive market, and we saw that from the beginning. A tenant doesn't have that much room for maneuver, doesn't have bargaining situation, bargaining conditions faced with the landlord, and that also can be extended to other sectors. The real estate agents, for instance, that is a service for the landlord, but actually the payment, the price has to be paid by the tenant, because that's how it is. That's how the situation is. So it's clear that we have some technical issues. So it's not about a lack of supply. It's a technical problem. It's a problem that has to do with power relations. The real estate agents, that they were very well organized. The banks, the investment funds, chambers of commerce, and the likes, etc. They were well organized. However, the tenants were not organized in the beginning. So that's the origin of our tenants union, because that's the idea. After we were born, we said we can change the rules of the game if we organize ourselves, so the rental market, as Barbara was saying, can become more affordable, more stable, healthier. So that was the initial premise. The union, our union, is conceived then as follows. First and foremost, our willingness is to be a mass organization. So we want to address the mass society, and we want to stay, because the real estate sector is powerful, and they have the political powers, and they can push the regulations maybe to their side of the story. We as tenants need to be big as well. We need to have a huge membership. So it's not just about a social movement that may vanish with time, but this relation will probably last a long time. So we want to be here for a long time. We want to be a permanent body, if you see what I mean. So this regulation framework is not fair. When we were born, let me go back to the beginning. When we were born, we organized different meetings and assemblies, and 80% of the people attending used to tell us this, what I explained before. Here's what I received, a notification, I need to leave my home. And people were wondering, is this even legal? You know, I've always paid my rent, the contract is now expiring. How come they're asking for twice as much suddenly overnight? So that's completely legal. So from scratch, we really realized that we needed to disobey, those unfair regulations, because of course no one wants to leave their home and change the kids from school. So we needed to start changing and having an impact, really lobbying on those regulations. Maybe I'm taking too long. Well, just interrupt me if it's too long. But we organized a campaign. It was called Ens quedem, meaning we're staying. That's the motto, we are staying. So when the contract expires, the family stays there, they live there, they continue paying the rent, and then they do some research on the landlord, because there's this mantra here saying that Spain is a country made up of small owners, widowers and widows that rent their flats. But no, that's not the case. It's a very compact, concentrated market. So that's what we advise. Okay, let's study the landlord, see how many many more properties he or she has. Then second step, try to organize with your neighbors, try to get together with them. So our individual conflict is now, my individual conflict is now our conflict. It's a group collective conflict. So it's not just about one tenant anymore, but a whole block, for instance, because otherwise it would be uneven. And then the tenants become stronger, because it's no longer one person or one family, but more than one. So collective bargaining, etc. And all together in order to have the contract renewed, extended, so that the family doesn't have to leave their home. So we prefigured then the regulatory changes that we will demand from the institutions. 2019, for instance, the rents were no longer 3-year long, the contracts, 7-year longs, and then a year ago we managed to have those price increases forbidden. So it's banned. So it's now moderate increases. So, well, for starters, as an initial framework, it's not bad. What we've achieved, we've done something, we've reversed the dynamics, so we now have bargaining power faced with the political power, so that we can start changing the rules of the game, and also with the private owners, so we can even sit at the same table with those large funds that, of course, nobody would have imagined it would be possible. You know, Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, Cerberus, and the likes. That is really a huge change. A conflict that was individual in the beginning is now collective. Okay, Barbara, anything to add, or maybe you have a question for Carme about the Barcelona Union?
Both, of course. First of all, I want to congratulate you. You made extreme important steps. And you said the magical word, it is collective bargaining. This is actually also what the trade unions are doing. When you have a problem with your employer, if you fight alone, your chances are not so good. If you are many, and if you then even consider a strike, your chances are better. So it is all about collectiveness. This is important. I'm just giving you some hint. I think one of the most important issues for the tenants movement and to achieve, let's say, equally balanced housing market was something in the rent law. In the countries where people make a choice to be a tenant, we have one criteria in the rental contracts. Our rental contracts are unlimited. This is the norm and not the exemption. So if you sign a rental contract, it's forever. There are some, let's say, exemptions when the landlord can throw you out. This is if he or his very close family is needing the apartment for himself. But then he has also to prove that he is moving into this apartment. And he cannot play this card that he needs the apartment for himself if you are in a very, let's say, vulnerable situation. So if it is not possible for you to find another apartment which is affordable in the same amount as the apartment you are staying in, if you have health problems, if you have a big family, let's say these are the hardship cases, and then it is not possible for the landlord to throw you out of the apartment, or say it, let's say, more moderate, to end your rental contract. And I think this was one of the breakthroughs in the rent law. Again, unlimited contracts must be the norm and not the exemption. And my question to Carme, in how far do you think this is achievable in Catalonia and in Spain?
Great question. I wish I had the answer. I don't know if I know. Oh, is the sound correct? Yes. Okay. It's just the beginning of the sentences. Okay. So it's a crucial aspect, what you just mentioned. What we managed was to ban extortion, systematic extortion with abusive price increases. But now what you mentioned is even better, because in this country, people are afraid of reporting that there are leaks in the ceiling or that there's damp on the wall, because they are afraid that their contract will not be renewed. So clearly we need contracts that renew themselves automatically, because it's incredible. The contract expires, the tenant is the perfect tenant, and the contract is not renewed just because. That's inadmissible. And then apart from this, which is not stable, the tenant is then being abused in such a way that they don't even speak out. They are scared to say what the problems are, because they are afraid of these retaliations. So in the labor market, we clearly understand that. Imagine if the contract is never-ending, let's say, and the rights of the employee, are being breached. Of course, this person has the power to complain and to do something about it. But it's not the case in the rental market. It's becoming more and more difficult. So back to your question. Actually, this is something we are working on right now. The topic is definitely on the table, and we are planning on working on this next year. We want a law passed for Catalonia, contemplating what you just said. Unless the landlord needs the flat for his use or the relatives, closest relatives, the contract should be automatically renewed always. So that's becoming more and more stable, so that people are not forced constantly to, or being pushed to actually considering buying the flat. So we are in agreement, we are aligned, so we are working on it, and hopefully in the next years we will try. Let's see if we achieve it. So this is one of the great pillars and the next conquests that we would like to achieve. Actually, it's very clear from what we hear that there are huge differences in terms of rights recognition. The fact that we had 3-year-long contracts here not that long ago, it's incredible. It would be unthinkable, for instance, in the case of Germany. And in the EU, when you work in the community, how come countries like Spain are so insecure, so precarious? How come there's such huge differences in the European Union countries? I mean, comparing Spain with Germany, with Sweden, there are guarantees there, and indefinite contracts to live in a house with no fears. The situation here is so precarious. And of course, we can talk about the labor market because it happens there as well. And I would like to ask you, Barbara, about Europe. Okay, that there is inequality also between the different European countries.
Absolutely, absolutely. You cannot compare the European countries, and every rent law is different, of course, in every country. But again, there is one line, a common line, in countries where you have big rental markets, large rental markets where people choose to become a tenant. There you have what we call a social rent law. And this social rent law is part of the civil law. And the social rent law, say one of the most important criteria is what I just said. Unlimited contracts are the norm. The second is that rent increases are only possible in clear caps. So it is not impossible. It is not possible for landlords to increase the rents in a, let's say, criminal way. So by 100 or even 200%, what Carme just said, that is not possible. Sometimes rent increases are in line with inflation rates. Sometimes they are in line with the consumer index, but they are all capped. And it is in the countries, in most of the countries, it is not possible to increase the rents every year. And in some countries, it is even possible, ladies and gentlemen, that the rents have to be decreased. When it is aligned with the consumer price index, sometimes the landlords have to go down the rent. So this is then also quite interesting for the tenants. And these are all regulations which have been achieved by as I said, a long-standing fight. Of course, we can say we are strong, but this is a fight more than 100 years already. So when you are at the beginning of this fight, like you are now in Spain, and I think it's great what Sindicat de Locateurs did so far, and how you mobilize the people. And the people are joining you because it was necessary that somebody is taking the representation for them. So this is something that has to be achieved in a tough way sometimes. And if the government is not listening to you, we also started with manifestations. We started with red strikes. We walked the streets. We are also activists. And this is something which is important because for tenants unions, we are not so welcome. Most of the time, the governments, they prefer to work with the establishment. And in housing markets, the establishment are the landlords. And so what we are also regularly doing, if we cannot find a solution with the governments, we walk the streets, we demonstrate, we organize referendum. I'm sure that you have read also in the media about the big demonstrations in Berlin that we organized, and so far the referenda that we organized, we mostly win them because the people know it is necessary to support the tenants movement. Otherwise, the landlords will continue to increase rents and they will continue with their for-profit policy. And this is also, I think, one very important issue. We have to, in a way, push our authorities and governments, and these are sometimes local authorities and governments. So in your case, it's the city of Barcelona, in order to change their housing policy towards more public, social, and affordable housing. They have to do an active housing policy. They have to become landlords themselves. And they are then controlled also by public bodies, by the city council. And in best of all cases, members of the city council are members also of the tenants union. This is how representation works, of course. And this is something where I do think that Sindicat Locataires is in an extremely good way. And we, the International Union of Tenants, we will do everything to support this, and we will back you, perhaps also with our historical experience on that.
Well, absolutely. It's key to increase the public housing stock. We've been doing that for some years. Barbara, you probably know this, but some years ago, together with other organizations like the Eviction Affected People Association and other organizations in Barcelona, we promoted the 30% law, which means that in new constructions and big renovations, private players have to include 30% of those housing units as social housing, social rental housing. And that's interesting because, of course, we believe that we need much more public housing and we should use all the available mechanisms to achieve that, be it the 30% law, new construction, a whole range of mechanisms. And it's interesting because so far we are the only ones speaking out. The employers or the landlords associations were not defending that. But now that we are passing new law, like the rental price regulation, the 2019 law that force big landlords to have a social responsibility, well, now the landlords are starting to take on that same discourse, the same narrative. And in the coming years, we will have to be wary because they will say, well, if today in Spain or in Barcelona or in Catalonia, we have a housing emergency problem, is because we lack public housing, which is partly true. But what the Spanish Constitution says is that both public housing and private housing have to meet a social function, a social role. So in a country in which 98% of the housing stock lies with private landlords, well, we cannot be distracted. And I believe that we need a change in the common sense, so to speak, because in the coming years, people will say that the housing emergency lies with the lack of supply and abundance of demand. So we need to counter that argument with a visible example, which is that of shop spaces. In Barcelona, if you walk down the city, you see that there are many commercial spaces that are empty. About 20% of Barcelona's commercial spaces are still empty after 2 years, but the price for those commercial spaces hasn't gone down, which comes to show that the real estate market does not work according to supply and demand. Because what we realize is that it's like a refuge capital market when the overhead costs of maintaining an empty commercial space are so low that big landlords, banks, investment funds, their prices are not regulated by the market. They have influence power, they have clout in the market. We've seen this in recent years. They'd rather have empty commercial spaces or empty flats, housing units, to generate this fake luck impression in a way, and to artificially increase the prices. So this is an argument that will be used frequently in coming years, and we need to be careful because, of course, on the one hand, we need much more public housing, but on the other hand, we cannot overlook that housing, private housing, has to meet a social function too, and administrations should prevent speculation from happening. And this is something that you can notice walking down the city, and that shows this phenomenon. What do you think about other mechanisms that are being used today? In Spain, we have the new housing law, and in Germany, right, there's been a bit of controversy regarding the regulation of rental prices. Do you think that regulating rental prices is an efficient way to do things? Do you think it supplements the public rental housing stock? What's your take on that?
A very clear yes. You need rent regulation, you need rent control. We call it, by the way, rent stabilization, because the housing markets today are highly dysfunctional. There is never enough supply of affordable housing, nowhere and never. There is a lot of supply of luxurious housing. There is a lot of supply of condominiums, but affordable rental housing is scarce. And this is all over the world. So yes, you see, there are some good ways to have more public, affordable and social housing. But these houses, these flats have to be built. This needs time. In the meantime, what do you do with the people who are in a private rental contract with a private landlord? You also have to help them. And helping them fighting unfair rent increases is to set up a system of rent control and rent stabilization. So you have to work on both markets, on the supply market to increase the public housing stock. And by the way, Carme and dear audience, 30% sounds good. But it's not so much. In Vienna, for instance, when we have new developments, the quota for social and affordable housing, it's 75%. And there we have a rent cap also of a maximum of €5 per square meter. And this is also not the exemption, this is the rule. And it is very easy to implement that. You do not need the federal government for that. It has been done by a so-called building ordinance of the city of Vienna, which means that the city council decided on that. And I do know that in Spain there are some controversies between the regional and the federal levels. And it is always for a rent law, because this is civil law, you always need the federal level, because this, I think, must be valid for every person in the country, in the nation. But when it comes to building ordinances, you can do it at local level. And this is faster. But again, we are not so fast in building enough public and social housing. I can tell you the country where we have the highest percentage of social housing, which is the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we have a share of 30% social housing. And I know that Carme studied in the Netherlands, me too. I also lived in Amsterdam for a very long time. And in the Netherlands, it's the same for everybody. Every person in the Netherlands, every citizen once lived in social housing, because this is actually how you start your housing career. So when you are 16, you can sign in the waiting list for social and affordable housing. And at a certain point, you will be in the position to have a social housing apartment. And this is a very good system, but the Netherlands also, it took them a long time to have this big housing stock of 30%. In the city of Vienna, this is the other example, which is always quoted when it comes to international housing policies. We have 220,000 social housing flats, which are social housing flats of the city of Vienna, which means that the city of Vienna is the largest social housing landlord all over the world. And this is also part of a 100-year history. My comment, I think 30% sounds nice for Barcelona, 30% social housing quota, but when you want to make some speed, it has to be higher.
Yeah, we fully agree on that one. Barbara said a very interesting thing, which is that even in those cities where they have 60% of social housing or public housing, the private market is still regulated. And that's very important. Since the private market has become a financial asset and it tends naturally towards speculation, so we still have to regulate the private market. And obviously, we have a robust private housing stock, and currently we are in an emergency situation. In the last 5 years in Barcelona, the rental prices in Barcelona have increased 30 times above salaries, and regulation is a solution. It's not a solution, but it's played the role of a stoppage, a barrier. I don't know if all of you here in the room are familiar with the regulation. Let me explain it briefly. How does it work? Well, on the one hand, new contracts cannot exceed the price of the previous contract, regardless of who is the tenant, whether it's the same person or not. And if prices exceed the average regional index, they have to take the prices down to the reference index price. A year after that, we can state two things. Number one, the mantra that was repeated before the law was passed, oh, supply will collapse if we regulate this, that has been totally denied and countered. We, in the previous month, more contracts than ever have been signed. And in those municipalities where rental prices have been capped and regulated, more contracts have been signed. And on the other hand, the law has managed to take prices down more than twice in those municipalities where the regulation has been in place. But we need to discuss the human factor. In our assemblies at the union, I think that the situation has changed dramatically. Before the price regulation, people came to assembly saying, look, my contract finishes in 2 months, in a year, and I don't know what will be of me. Will I have to change districts, to change cities? And now, at least there's no incentive to expel families, to force them out, because they know that even if the tenant changes, they will not be able to increase the price. And basically that gives stabilization to the rent price or to the rental option. So as taking stock now, another difference will be made compared to what Barbara was saying. This year and in the coming months, there will be a strong media campaign saying that in Barcelona, the housing supply has collapsed by 42%, or that in Madrid prices have been reduced further than in Barcelona. And this will be said by real estate portals. Of course, in any European country, it would be unthinkable of to believe things said by a website, by a real estate agent or portal, like Idealista in Spain. Nobody would believe that. But here in Catalonia, we do have a guarantee registry, and we know the actual price that is being paid for housing. But in other parts of Spain, they lack the data. They don't have the information. So that makes it difficult to make public policies and to assess them rigorously. And constantly, interested parts of the market, those parts that have been benefited, well, basically, they do not support the public policy making. So we will have to be careful, because it's kind of concerning and dangerous.
Anything to add, Barbara? Anything to add after Carme's intervention?
Yeah, I think I'm made this important point.
It sounds like science fiction, probably, she's saying now, when she speaks about the south of Europe and saying that there's no cap to prices, that the market is not regulated, that when the contract expires, the landlord can actually increase the price as much as they like. These questions sound like science fiction. It's not even common sense, socially speaking, Paula is saying now. So in this struggle between the rights, the market, the rights have succumbed, and really the market seems to dominate now, or it's been the case in the past few years. So probably with the different changes, parties in power, and the deregulation, the classical neoliberal deregulation has also taken its toll. So it's normal that there's now another common sense, this awareness in the sense that this right needs to be integrated, and the law is important, and the law matters, and in the past we seemed to have neglected it. So it's important now to have this integrated into the public discourse, and the fact that there's a union now speaking out for numbers of families, not just an individual, but this is a problem affecting this block of apartments, this whole district. So that's structural, that's completely structural. So it's not about Maria or Joanna, it's not about them saving their housing unit at some point in time, but the question is that we all need to live a calm way, in a calm manner. So I'm asking you both now, just let me risk it like that. Paula says, the fact that the rights are not that valued in certain countries, socially speaking, I guess this has also something to do with the tradition, unionism and union movements, the traditions in the different countries. So the traditional unions, it seems now, are going downhill, if I can put it this way, in the political sphere, in terms of the political struggle. So the tenants union, do you think it's a new type of trade union that can respond to the changes in the contemporary society that maybe other unions had not tackled? Or I wonder whether there are other movements apart from the classical movements, housing unionism in Germany, in Sweden, that are now emerging, because there are new claims and new debates, even though many rights are recognized in other European countries, but there are other movements, other concerns. So let's discuss the right to housing in the framework of this struggle for social justice and social rights. Whoever wants to reply.
Perhaps I start a little bit from the international point of view. First of all, I think when it comes to housing rights and the representation of housing rights, I think you should definitely become a member of a tenant union, because what we are doing at the same time, we are doing your political representation, but we also give you legal aid. when you have a problem with your landlord, we are there for you. And we go also to court. We represent you legally, and I think this is something which is very important, that you have professional representation, a legal representation, when it comes to one of, I think, the hardest struggles you can have when you lose your home. And this is one of the hardest experiences a person can have, being evicted without a reason, an unfair eviction. So I do think that it is very important to underline that. We are specialized in all questions of fair housing markets, affordable housing markets, and the right to housing. And this is something which is very normal, let's say, in the global north, in the countries before you sign a rental contract, a new rental contract in a city, you become a member of our union. This is the same. You call, hey, I'm here. I'm going to sign a rental contract. Can I become a member? So this is very normal. This is also a model which is not working there, but we have been very happy and glad and proud to learn that this model of a classical tenant union representation is now also starting at the Balkans. We have just set up unions in Northern Macedonia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Albania. These are countries where we do not have a rental law at all. And we have been in contact with civil society there for a long time. And they asked us, how can we manage to get a right to housing in our constitutions? How can we manage to have a fairer balance between tenants and landlords? How can we get a social rent law? And our recommendation was, okay, become a union. Give legal advice to the people, help the people who have problems with their landlord, and they will become your member, and you will get stronger and stronger and stronger. So it's an old-fashioned traditional model, but it is still working. And telling you about this example from the Balkans, there we are at the really beginning. I mean, in Barcelona, you are already advanced because there are already some great achievements which have been powered by Sindicato de Locataires. But there, they are really starting, and we are doing this. And it is about the system of tenants unionism is about solidarity. The strong unions, like the Swedish union, the French union, the German union, the Austrian union, the Union of Switzerland. We help those unions in the countries that are at the beginning. So it's all about solidarity. And I think this is something very important. You are never alone. And if you're starting this business and fighting for the right to housing, there is a strong movement behind you, a strong international movement, which is a big network all over the world. And yeah, I can only encourage to go on with that and yeah, become a member.
About the question you were asking before about the role of housing unionism, or in general social movements, I can say actually my answer would be this capitalism is more and more financialized, and we have now more and more tenants unions, and that's not by chance, that's not random, because where's the capital now being invested? Into the housing market. And of course, with this financial issues, there are constant insecurities, but faced with that, you were wondering about changing in terms of changing the common sense. And that's been key. That's been really paramount. Let me put it this way. Before the arrival of our union and other social movements, what we heard was, well, the prices in Barcelona are increasing increasing because Barcelona is a global metropolis and there's more demand. The demand is growing and it's only natural, and this process is irrenounceable and non-stoppable. And the task has been there for us even before the arrival of the platform of citizens affected by mortgages, etc. But you heard experts or so-called experts on TV, radio, but they were clear in terms of their vested interests in the lines of real estate. So we had to break down those narratives and say, hey, housing is right. It's not it's not a financial asset. Supply and demand, well, that's not what's going to have an influence or the final say on the prices of the housing unit, but actually the increase in the past few years that we've seen, that's been clearly political. It's been a political change and a political willingness. The housing market in Spain is not made up of small owners, not at all. Half of the market belong to owners that have more than 3 housing units as their property. So they live on that. That's how they earn their living. And of course, not to mention the companies having or owning 10 or 15 different premises. And there are more and more stakeholders in this market. And last but not least, this the creation of a collective group in the midst of a desert. Because in the past, the figure of the tenant, how can I put it, was not conceived as a group, was not conceived collectively. So when the union was born here 4 years ago, we were born with a figure. Hey guys, we have 100,000 families living as tenants and paying our rent. So we need to organize ourselves and we need to revert the situation because the situation is affecting us. So this combination, the fact that we need to challenge the public narrative because that was not true, and then on the other side we need to organize ourselves so that we can sit and negotiate with the landlords. We can negotiate as well with the political powers, because as an organization we've been growing little by little. These two aspects have been key, very important. So these are the two sides of our struggle. Yes, these past 4 years have been impressive, I can reassure you, and you've had such an impact as a tenants union. I would like to hear from the floor now. I would like to hand over to the audience here at El Born. So any questions from the audience, any remarks, observations about what you've just heard? Yes, there's a question here. Yes, hello. In Catalan, is that okay? Yes, of course. Hello, Barbara. Hello, Carme. I have a question for Carme about the tenants union here in Barcelona that is such an important body now in the struggle for the right to housing. How are you relating to the other district movements, the unions, the district unions, as we call them, because sometimes the strategies they follow are different, but you, of course, I take it, share goals? Yes. Yes, and it's a good question, because 4 years back, our union was born and we started off based with this figure. We want our members to be really engaged in a direct manner, people that are, of course, affected. So membership was key because we wanted to grow. And of course, people didn't even need to have a problem to become a member. It's just because they were tenants. Because, okay, the problems in terms of tenants and rentals is not to do with income levels. It's just because you are renting that you might have a problem, that you might be at risk. And that was our point precisely when we created the union, because you don't need to have an issue to come to us. You're a tenant, come join us, because you might have a problem because the market is insecure. So what we are trying to do, as I said before, is to work on collective negotiation prior to eviction. That's the premise. Before the problem ends up in court, let's try collective bargaining. Let's try lobbying, let's try pressuring things and pushing the landlord so that you can have your contract renewed. And unfortunately, there are very diverse conflicts in the city. As you can imagine, the situations are very diverse, and there is precariousness in the city in other aspects. So it complements each other. This complements each other. We have the union, as Barbara was saying before. We have our legal consultants. Of course, we have a communication body that's important. We have our union activities. We organize movements, and that is compatible with what every district is doing, because in the different neighborhoods they face the cruelty of evictions, you name it, many other problems. So it's a virtuous cycle, because many cases we even handle together, the district union and our union. Let's tell about Juan and Lydia. Okay, I'm going to explain this case, the case of Juan and Lydia. And we worked with the district of Gracia in Barcelona. They paid €1,000 per month. That was their contract, and the increase was going to be from 1,000 to 1,300. So €300 increase all of a sudden. So in coordination with the district, we worked on that case, and it made it so evident, so patent, that it was necessary to say, hey, we need price regulation. This family, they've been paying on a regular basis €1,000 per month. They are about to be expelled because the landlord suddenly wants $300 more. It's a virtuous cycle. Tomorrow we have an action planned together with this district, the Union District of Gracia. There's another neighborhood called Poble Sec, and we are now working with them, and the people becoming member with them are automatically member to our union. So it's this dual membership, and it's totally complementary, totally supplementary, and hopefully we'll be more and more united. When we organize campaigns, we try to go together, go aligned. So that's the way ahead, we think, because from our differences we can fight for a common objective.
More questions, remarks? Anything else you would like to ask about the Sindicat de Llogateres, the Catalan Tenants Union, how to become a member, for example? So there are two ways we can relate to rights and become political subjects. As Barbara explained, someone is about to sign a rental contract, and of course their tenant rights have to be protected. There's no doubt about it. There are a series of rights and they have to be met. But here we are so used to being abused. We've had a very long dictatorship and many crises. I don't really know how to interpret it, but it's true that we have this impression that we are not entitled here, that we don't have rights. And there's a certain acceptance of housing abuses. I think it's interesting to talk about becoming a union member very openly. As the Sindicat de Llogateres, we have always wanted to say out loud that we are many in this situation and we want things to change and to be financially independent. We don't want to depend of external financing to be politically independent. And because if you have financial muscle, well, you have a resistance fund, which means that people are much more daring to stand up and fight, because they know that if things go wrong, the union will support them, and people therefore are more courageous, and to pay for legal counseling, for example. So to have both things, disobedience on the one hand, but also to be able to offer legal counseling, and also to have people in the union that can make the organization grow further. if we want to have continuity, of course, we need people who do the red tape and other people who work on increasing the members. Yeah, financial independence. It's so important. What about the IUT, Barbara? How do you work? Do you have external financing? It's only through membership fees that you finance yourselves?
We are exclusively financed by membership fees. We also think this is very important in order to be independent and to have a strong voice. And we are a clear interest representative of tenants. We are lobbyists for tenants. And sometimes it is very important to have a strong voice and to have also this long-standing resistance against governments. And so we are only financed by membership fees, which makes us also quite poor, because this is sometimes very hard also for our members to pay the fee, but we always find a way for them, because we do not want to lose them, of course. But there are some unions who accept external financing, and those financing is mostly coming from the ministries for consumer affairs. So they finance sometimes the startup of tenants unions. But at a certain point, tenants unions then become independent because it's for us more interesting to have a strong voice, and strong voices are independent voices, I would say. So this is one important issue. But what I also wanted to say, it's a little bit another theme now. We have a lot of young people becoming our members because they see it is nearly impossible to find affordable housing now at the regular markets. It is nearly impossible to find housing in the social and affordable housing markets because the waiting lists are already too long. So our members, in search for affordable housing, our young members, they say, okay, we have to change the situation. They are students or they are young families, starters at the housing markets. And they join us and say it is also important to fight politically, to fight for a more fairer housing policy. And a kind of catalyst in this movement was the short-term rentals. I'm talking about Airbnb and Co. They have many, many names, but I think the most known is Airbnb. Many people see that this short-term rentals, this is, I think, the worst thing of capitalism you can have on the housing market currently. And we do see that it is now more and more professionalized what is happening there on the short-term rental market. This is not the family who is renting out their apartments when they are on holidays for 3 weeks. This is a professional movement. Housing is extracted from the regular housing market. It is bought by professional investors, and then it is rented out on day or week basis. And this is a profit machine. And this, let's say, I would say, hardest form of capitalism you can have on the housing market. This brought us a lot of members because especially young people said, this would have been an apartment I could have rented. But now it is bought by an institutional investor and it is rented out on day basis on Airbnb. So this is also something that brought us a lot of members and especially young members. So this is important. What we also do see when it comes to the financialization of the housing markets, many people are directly affected by the actions of Blackstone and Co. Because what these institutional investors are doing currently at the housing markets, they are doing illegal things. They evict people by renovations. We call this renovictions. They do unfair and illegal rent increases. They also make a lot of mistakes when it comes to the operational cost, the charges on housing. So also these institutional investors, although they are big, they make a lot of mistakes. And we, our lawyers working for the tenants unions, we are checking these mistakes. And if they are not changing their behavior, then we go to court. And this brought us really a lot of young members, and the financialization of the housing markets. I think it needs a stronger tenants movement. Otherwise, we will not be able to balance all those criminal actions we have sometimes.
The problem with housing touristification and Airbnb, well, it has been quite a problem in Barcelona. As you said, we're not talking about people who rent their room or their flat when they go on holidays. No, we are talking about a highly professional market. These are companies that have flats on Airbnb. And of course, that means that these flats would normally be in the regular market. They would be available for Barcelona people, and they are basically deviated and included in the tourist market. That increases the prices and increases gentrification of our neighborhoods. And I think that internationally, we've seen very powerful things. Some Dutch cities, I think it's Amsterdam and Rotterdam, just passed a law that bans investors from buying houses. Basically, if you buy a house there, it's to live in. Otherwise, you cannot buy it. Well, that's a totally different paradigm. In Barcelona, we are not discussing this very much. And in the coming weeks and months, we will have a debate on the PEWAT. Could you tell us what the PEWAT is? The PEWAT was a tool that was developed to face both tourist growth and tourist housing. Currently, we have a specific proposal. It's a bit complicated, but basically the Catalan government drafted a law last summer while they were negotiating the price regulation. They basically, it was done under the table, and any house can start renting out rooms legally. So that's what is allowed by the legal framework of the Catalan government. But we are planning a ban on this in Barcelona. We want to stop it. So to legalize the fact that there is a tourist room in a regular housing unit would be okay, but a city council has no ability whatsoever to regulate this kind of activity. And therefore, this will give rise to many more tourist flats. Over the last month, the tourist lobby is basically lobbying the city council and different political groups for them not to pass a ban on tourist rooms, but to regulate them so that you can rent them out for less than 31 days a year. So this is just an open door for more tourist housing, because the city council cannot control whether you're renting out a room for 31 days or 160. So we will have to discuss this in the coming weeks, because if we are regulating rent, but we are seeing these under the table things, well, it's not a trade-off. So we will have to discuss it and pay attention to any communication and piece of news, because it's going unnoticed, and the tourist lobby is really exercising pressure for this to be passed. Yeah, it's a problem for touristy cities. Barcelona is like the tourism princess of the Mediterranean, and Barcelona has a serious problem with that regarding the coexistence with tourism to be able to leave despite tourism in a way. More questions, remarks? Nobody else? Barbara, would you like to make some final remarks or final reflection to close this?
Yes, of course. With this short-term rental, I think this is one of the hardest fights that we have to go for in the future. Because again, this is capitalism poor. There are possible restrictions that you can do in Barcelona yourself. It is very common in some cities. For instance, in Lisbon, we have also a lot of short-term rental problems, also in Paris, but also in Stockholm, also in Berlin. In nearly every capital, actually, we do have it. London, Belfast. It is possible to work with zoning law. And zoning law, in that case, would mean that in a certain quarter where there is already an affordable housing scarcity, where is a lack of affordable housing, you can define this quarter as a city. You can say in this quarter, there is a ban to rent out houses on short-term rental platforms. A ban. This is very hard, but it is possible. It is also possible, and this was also something said by Carme, that there are many commercial real estates empty in Barcelona. This is a phenomenon we also know at international level. It is called buy to leave empty, because this is also a phenomenon at the real estate market. If you do nothing, if you do not invest, even if you do not rent out, the value of your real estate will get higher and higher and higher by doing nothing. So it is also possible to ban this buy to leave empty. And this can be done by the city council. You do not need a federal law for that. It is, of course, perfect if you have a federal law, but sometimes it's hard to get that. So there are, let's say, several possibilities how we can work together. And this has all been already invented. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. And this is what I always claim for. Take a look to the left, take a look to the right, and see what other countries have been doing so far. And there are always possibility to fight some problems at the housing market, which seems to be structural, so not possible to change it, but it is possible to change it. And there I'm a big fan of hard law. I think there we need really a good representation. We need lawyers fighting for us, and we need policymakers negotiating those laws. And I do hope, I truly do hope that in Barcelona, in Catalonia, and in Hail, Spain, that we will have a social rent law with rent caps, rent control, and very high quotas for social and affordable housing. And I would be happy to be part of this process. If you need some advices, please address us, the International Union of Tenants, and we can definitely help, and we will continue to help Sindicat de Locatores.
Yes, hopefully we will be stronger if we fight together. Carme, anything from you? Yes, along the lines of what Barbara was saying in the beginning, precisely, I just would like to wrap up by saying the rental market is, advancing because of the relationship between the real estate sector as a whole and then the counterpart, which are the unions or different platforms that struggle for the right to housing, and that's the counter. We are the counter power, and that's been evident in the past few years as Spain was negotiating a law on housing. Pedro Sanchez was meeting Blackstone in New York to reassure the investors, saying that everything was all right. And it's scary because they are organized. They are constantly working on media campaigns, judicialization campaigns, so taking cases to court and calling different politicians so that they're in their favor. So it's really very hopeful to listen to Barbara today and realize that it doesn't have to be like that, because we can organize ourselves, and the laws, the regulations that are so unfair and that take us to actually spending that much in the concept of rent, that can be changed. So that's my final note. I mean, until 4 years back, Spain, the politicians, call it what you want, thought that was the case, that was the situation. But now the union is here, we are here, and we're working, and the financial market is being faced against different unions that are facing them. And we, as the unions, as the fighters, are the hope, so that housing is actually a right and not a financial asset anymore. So that's a great final comment, this ray of hope, this unification of forces here and there in Brussels with Barbara and elsewhere. So anyone can really join the forces and fight together with this struggle, where lobbies are really working hard, because they really see that the population is becoming more and more organized indeed. So that would be the end of this cycle of conferences devoted to housing. We would like to thank you all very much for joining us, those who've been loyal to the 3 sessions especially. So in the future, we will continue with references, because that's a space to reflect upon the contemporary world. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Born. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, technicians.